There's something to be said for humble beginnings. If you can manage to get yourself out of the gutter, then the only place to go from there is up. And once upon a time, there was a boy born in brutal Bootle. Now, you don't get much more humble than that. In fact, it was said that in Bootle, even the bugs wore clogs, and the kids played tick with hatchets. Mattered not to the boy that the ducks flew backwards over hell's own Bootle with tears in their eyes, because he was driven from the hospital to his family in Miseryside in a Rolls Royce owned by Lord Leverhulme. His mum, you see, worked as a maid in the Viscount's home in Thornton Huff, and driving in that luxury, you can imagine that infant thinking, "This is all right, mate." And fate had smiled upon the babe from birth. So things were going to be all right. But not yet. His dad worked at the northern coal mines, and money was tight. It was tight because of the meagre work, but also because Rolly was born ninth of what was to be 14 children. And 13 turned out to be an unlucky number of siblings indeed when their mum fell ill and lost her job. Despite being named Rolly for his ride in the Rolls Royce, the poor lad felt less than regal. He and his sisters, police-clad in the D's standard hand-out brown corduroys and, yes, iron-tipped clogs. Even the teachers at school had little hope for him, cross that he could never finish his homework, not knowing that it was incessant hunger and the careful use of gaslight at home that kept him from completing his tasks. But no one could stay cross with a young lad who so selflessly looked after his two deaf-mute brothers, and a lad who so easily pulled out stories from his Irish grandfather. Stories of kind princesses and far-off lands, of villains and heroes and giants that ate people. It was so cute, the teacher said, that Rolly seemed to believe the stories were true. His dad didn't share their sentiments. And when Rolly, declaring with all the confidence of a 13-year-old, said that one day he would be as rich as Lord Leverhulme, his dad retorted, "That'll be one of your fairy tales, lad. Get your head out of the clouds. Remember where you come from." Rolly thought about what his dad said all the following day, and even though he was young, he knew from the stories his granddad told him that you could accept what people said about you, or you could choose your own story. No, he thought. His head was not in the clouds. His feet were planted firmly on the ground. Lord Leverhulme's family hadn't started out wealthy, and look where he'd got to. He did his milk rounds with more than mere enthusiasm. He did them with vision, imagining his own milk empire. And taking the cigarette butts from his dad and rolling them up into second-hand fags, he pretended to smoke them like the men at the gentlemen's club where he collected glasses. So practical was his dream of being rich that he even went as far as asking his brothers, sisters, cousins, uncles, aunts, grandparents and parents each to buy him a penknife for his birthday, knowing that, in order to prove that they weren't given in anger, each of his family members would have to hand over a penny first. "Save your pennies, save your pounds," his grandfather always said. But he also taught him how to spend, often recounting how he'd gone to India and bartered down a pineapple from 6 rupees to 5 and then sold it on for 7. So young Rolly took those pennies and saved them and then sold the penknives too. Yet in the midst of all this furious entrepreneurial pursuit, something happened. Rolly's sister wanted a piano for her birthday, and she said she'd saved up for months the pennies that she'd got from helping her mom deliver washing in the evenings. It was only fair that he did the same. Rolly had never thought about what his money-making schemes had cost other people, and he hated the thought of earning off other people's backs, especially seeing his parents were so bent over, just trying to make ends meet. And so, quite relieved, he said yes. He would do whatever he could to buy that dream piano. A piano was rather pricey, but Rolly and his grandfather managed to buy a pianola. And not being able to be kept in the cramped 2-up, 2-down that Rolly's parents rented, it was stored at the grandparents' house on the high street. And when Rolly worked in their shop below the flat, he could hear through the floorboards the sounds of his grateful sister playing, and he beamed. It didn't just make him glad, it changed him. He couldn't find the words for it then, but he'd seen that the pursuit of money was not a worthy cause in its own right. Money was a means to an end. He was going to use what he earned to help the people he loved to be happy. Bolstering this thought was a story that his grandfather had told about the famous Jack and how his jealous brother had tried to teach him the meaning of money, and in turn, instead, only learned the value of living life to the full. Thought Rolly, not for the first or the last time in his life. So the stories were true. What he didn't know was that the next part of his tale was about to begin. His dad returned home from war to find the coal mines had closed, but being a war hero, his wife said he should appeal to her ex-employer for help. He didn't want alms, he said proudly to the Lord when he approached him. He wanted to work. Lever Hume loved that spirit, and so gave him a job at Terry's down south. Now, down south to Rolly's dad was actually south of Birmingham, in Redditch. And even though they moved so far away from Rolly's beloved grandfather, that sadness was soon eased by the wonderful surprise that Terry's could solve all your spring problems. Because his dad, unlike so many other unfortunate men who returned home from war, got a new spring in his step. As a result, he worked his way to a higher position, earning a higher wage, and the family were able to move into a good-sized house. It even had a garden where Rolly's dad kept bees, and all through the sweet rations, he'd cut off chunks of honeycomb for the kids to suck on. Life only got sweeter when Rolly won a position as a machine shop steward at Austin in Longbridge. And it seemed only right, now that he was working his way higher and higher in the British Motor Corporation, that he should buy himself an Austin Maxi. Now that he had a car, every Friday he'd take off his collar and place it in the collar's limited box with his name on it and zoom off to take his younger brother to youth group. He'd zoom because helping at the youth group was a girl. Her name was Robin, and he first saw her when she was coming out of the hall, rifling through her bag, trying to find the B&H she'd stolen from her mother. She looked just like a princess from one of his stories, dark hair curling around her elfin face. He stepped out of the car, walked up to her, pulled out his Zippo lighter and said, "Do you need a light?" "Yes," she said brightly, "I do." And just like that, they were smitten. A few nights and a few more lights, and he had the courage to ask her dancing. It wasn't long before they were going steady and on the long drives to Blackpool, to the Tower Ballroom, where they danced and swayed their summers away. He told her stories, and he listened to her story too. Life had also been tough for Robin. The family had sometimes only been able to eat the eggs from their chickens, and their mother had made Robin's and her sister's dresses with whatever scraps she could pull together, and she tried to embroider them as best she could. So when Robin got out of school, to pay her own way, she got a job at Boots on Coventry Road and later at Hedges, where they treated her better. Her dad worked at an abattoir. He killed hundreds of sheep and cattle every week without shedding a tear, she said. But he definitely cried when their pet beagle died. Mad as hatters, beagles are, and heavy drinkers too. Rolly laughed, but he could see that Robin's poverty still hurt her, and so he drove her down to London to see how the other half lived. At Sandringham, they placed down pieces of a puzzle that the Queen herself had started. And as Rolly told her about how he wanted to be rich and what he was going to do with the money to make his family happy, their hands reached for the same piece of puzzle, and holding it there, they looked at each other and knew that they'd each found their own missing piece. And they kissed, right there, in that palace, like a fairy tale. Then, poof, Rolly was gone from Robin's life. National service had been reinstated, and Rolly had to serve his time in the Navy. He worked on the Crystal Radio on the HMS Bicester in the Northern Artillery, heading out from Chatham Docks and over to Elba in Germany. He learned every single rule in the ship's code, knowing that at sea, a mistake could cost lives. It wasn't all tension and discipline and focus. On their days off, the Navy's own Brill Cream boys would go off to Bavaria and drink a pint of Good Birth by St. Paul's Brewery and take turns telling each other Mick Miller one-liners. Rolly's funniest memory, though, was when Mountbatten came to do the fleet inspection, and one of the men, obviously having gathered together all his Gibbs Dental Floss tick cards, had pinned to his breast his toothpaste medal. And when Mountbatten got to him and stopped, the man quaking in his boots. He said, "Well, that looks like a new one. You must have done something very special indeed. Well done, lad, well done." And then he shook his hand vigorously, and it was all the crew could do not to burst out laughing, seeing the relief on the joker's face. Rolly told many stories aboard the ship, of course, and also gathered new stories in far-off lands, which he wrote to Robin about. But what he longed to do was to take her to those far-off places. When his time in the Navy was done, he didn't go home. He headed straight to her folks' place, where Robin's sister said where he'd find her. And Rolly found her at the Greek Cypriot bar in Brum. There, on that New Year's Eve of 1961, she stood with her dark hair crowning her fairy princess face, rifling through her bag for a B&H, hers this time. He walked on over, got on one knee, pulled out his Zippo lighter and said, "Do you need a light?" "Yes." She smiled all over. "I do." And then, still on one knee and lighting her cigarette, he said, "Suppose you'll be wanting to marry me then too." "Yes," she said again. "I do. Now get up off the floor and kiss me." When they'd done kissing, which didn't take a short time, Rolly said, "That's right. That's where we left off. Now, about their wedding. We have to get married after the 16th of March. "Why?" said Robin, thinking he'd found religion at sea. "Is that because that's when Lent ends?" "No," said Rolly. "That's when the fishing season ends." His Navy experience afforded him a good position at BSA, where he earned a fat wage of £11.58. Finally, they were able to support their family as they'd longed to do, and also to go to see some amazing places in the world, like Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia, with its theme of "So the future may learn from the past." Their favourite place, though, was Japan, where in one day Rolly had a suit measured and made. But Rolly and Robin didn't strike it rich until they'd struck out. BSA closed its branch in Redditch, and even though, as personnel manager, Rolly was the last to leave, by that time he still couldn't work out what he was going to do to earn money. So he appealed to an old friend of sorts, Lord Leverhulme, who got a job for his wife in Unilever as a secretary. After a few months, though, she found out that the company was treating its workers in the Congo worse than slaves, that many, many people were dying in the awful factory conditions, and she couldn't, in all good conscience, remain in the job. She, too, was determined not to earn off other people's backs. "Well," said Rolly, depressed at the fall of his hero, "it appears the giants do eat people." "We'll have to start from scratch," said Robin, looking at their failing finances. But she wasn't upset. She was excited, because she had a plan. They did start from scratch, selling office furniture out of their own garage to Unilever customers they didn't mind using. Over time, they built up their business. She selling stockings in Kidderminster Market while cash was still low, and he working in the evenings inspecting needles. Until eventually, their company was supplying furniture to every single airport in all of the UK. They had struck rich. However, after meeting the kind of villains who should only live in stories, they were sure, along with their families, to go to every single worthwhile protest they could, like Ban the Bomb in Trafalgar Square, where they were joined by 100,000 other people, and the Peace Camp over in Greenham Common. And because they had humble beginnings and had learned many a lesson themselves, they treated their workers well. And just like Lucky Jack, they were free with their money, giving it to everyone they loved and more, starting up charities across the globe. In the end, when all was said and done, when boys had grown up to collect kit cars and become barristers and drive Ferraris, and daughters looked after mum in her ill health, when that grand old couple had visited no less than 24 countries, and when their grandchildren, who didn't even like to read, still loved Grandad's stories, everyone who knew Rolly and Robin could say that they were the heroes of their own story. And it might not have been a fairy tale exactly, but it was definitely a story of success.